They found the note, and then, later, the hole in the story, a gap that smelled of betrayal and blood. Two men the FBI cherished as assets, known in the quiet shorthand of counterintelligence as M&M, were lured back to Moscow and executed. The KGB's signature? A single bullet to the head. No parade, no trial that any impartial court would call fair, only a clean, brutal ending that read like a sentence and an accusation at once. Imagine the moment the phones in the FBI's Soviet counterintelligence section began to ring that autumn of 1986. Not the ordinary clatter of daily work, but hard, insistent calls. We have lost men. We have lost everything they knew. They have been taken back. You do not simply lose two sources and carry on. You lose a map of human trust, a ledger of lives you promised to protect. For those who had spent decades building networks behind the Iron Curtain, the shock was less an event than an earthquake. Foundations shifted, secrets tumbled, entire operations reeled. In the center of that tremor sat a name no one expected to see in a vault of betrayal, a man who wore the badge of protector, who sat beside his colleagues at briefings and lectures and family barbecues. He read classified papers by day and prayed at Mass by night. He had 6 children. He taught them to kneel at the altar. He taught them to be good. And yet, as the puzzle pieces fell into a terrible pattern, the impossible shape of the truth took form. One of the keepers had been quietly passing what they guarded to the enemy. Robert Philip Hanssen. Even the cadence of that name carried something ordinary, almost kindly. The name of a neighbor, a man you might trust with your spare key. But by the time reporters would circle, by the time families would learn what they had lost, by the time acronyms like KGB and GRU would be spelled with the weight of death behind them, that name would be the wound in the institution, the label for the worst intelligence disaster the FBI had ever seen. The first 2 minutes of this story are a knife held at the throat of memory, the searing realization that the people entrusted to guard a nation's most delicate, painful, necessary secrets could themselves become the leak. The first 2 minutes are also the moment you decide whether you will look away or step into the cold rooms where men once bent over files and listened to the echoes. This is not fiction. This is how trust got traded for diamonds and cash, for ego and grievance, and something deeper and darker that even confesses itself under a priest's roof. It is the tale of a seemingly banal American life, of childhood punishments, of a father's severe love, of a man who learned to hide what he felt, colliding with the largest ideological conflict of the 20th century. It's also the story of the people who tried to find him, the analysts bent over yellowing dossiers, the agents who dared to suspect their colleague, the families who woke one morning to discover that the man they loved had been living 2 lives. So begin with the clack of someone dialing, with a photo of 2 men that will never again be smiled at, with the question that rang down marble halls and into small cubicles across Washington: who among us has been giving away our entire world? We will walk through his life and the catastrophe he left behind. We will trace the slow arc from secret to exposure, from quiet compromise to the public unmasking that made America ask whether loyalty could ever be trusted again. We will listen to the detectives, to the priests, to the wife who found a letter in the basement and could not unsee the meaning, to the men whose names were crossed out on lists. And we will ask in the end, what does it mean to be betrayed by one of your own? What does it mean to forgive, to understand? This is Robert Philip Hanssen's story, a human story told against the hum of classified machines, the whisper of dead drops, and the cold geometry of fear. And once you hear it, you cannot unknow it.
To understand the man who betrayed the nation, we must first step into the ordinary rooms of his early life, the cheap linoleum of a family kitchen, the commands of a father's voice, the strange solace of ritual. Robert F. Hanssen was born into a kind of American template, mid-20th century, patriotic, working-class roots that prized order and duty. His father served in the Navy and later wore a police uniform. His mother kept the home. The household was strict, the discipline severe. Stories in the private record of this family read like warnings about early physical punishments that left more than bruises. They left a hunger for approval and a brittle armor. We often tell espionage stories as if they sprout from ideology alone. Red versus blue, patriot against traitor. But people are not ideologies. People are cravings and humiliations and the quiet calculus of what they must do to live. In Robert's case, childhood left him with a complicated appetite, a desire for recognition, an ache for esteem from a father who rarely gave praise, and a fixation on the decorum of control. He dressed like a mortician, loved neatness, adopted a posture of quiet superiority. He converted to Catholicism with zeal, embraced Opus Dei's simplest promises of sanctity through discipline, and he became the kind of man who collects outward markers of moral seriousness. At Knox College, he studied chemistry, and tellingly took classes in the Russian language, an interest that would later shape his life. He flirted with the idea of becoming a dentist. He quit and drifted toward law enforcement. He became an internal affairs investigator, then an FBI agent, a natural path for someone who worshipped systems and liked to be the man who knew the rules. Yet inside this structured march, a private world thrummed. Infidelities that would stain his marriage, a compulsion toward control that at times took on bizarre shapes, invitations to watch his wife, secret photographs, secret relationships. These details are not explanations, only contours of a strange interior. When he married Bonnie, she later described the moment she found a secret letter, an admission of treachery in the basement. She demanded an end. He promised. The promise lasted, so did the secret. The genius of this life was its ordinary face, a devoted Catholic husband, a man who volunteered at church and enjoyed a small, quiet suburban dignity. He wore that face like a uniform. It obscured the things he would later do. This chapter of his life matters because it teaches us a lesson often elided in spy thrillers. Betrayal does not always arrive on a map with red pins. It often grows in the cracks created by childhood denial and adult hunger. Hanssen's early years gave him two things every great spy needs: access to power and a sense that power could be shaped by his hands alone.
The FBI is not merely a job. For many who enter it, it is a vocation, a promise of service wrapped in quiet competence. For Hanssen, the Bureau offered structure, deference, and, crucially, access. He had a head for numbers, forensic accounting, a taste for pattern and order, and soon that aptitude brought him into the orbit of national security, the Soviet counterintelligence world, a place where secrets were a commodity and small facts could topple careers. He began in the Midwest and moved to New York, taking on the technocratic tasks the Bureau prized, building databases, automating case systems, mapping the invisible architectures of espionage. Those jobs gave him what few violated agents get so easily: keys. He could see files. He could touch the ledger of American intelligence. He could learn intimately who watched whom, where dead drops were placed, which operations were alive and which were fragile. In 1979, under the dull hum of a city that never sleeps, he stepped through the doors of an innocuous Soviet trade office and placed an anonymous letter on a desk. The audacity of that motion, walking into a soft target, sliding an envelope into the hands of military intelligence, is the moment the man with two faces decided to embrace the one that would change history. He told himself it would be small, a supplement to a government salary that strained beneath mortgage payments and private school tuitions. But systems devour small lies the way ice devours sunlight, slowly, inevitably. The first payments were modest, a few $1,000s. Yet the first bargains are the most dangerous. When you discover you can convert secrets into cash, the temptation becomes a map of what you can buy: safety, status, escape. But for Hanssen there was something else: the intoxicating sense of being indispensable to two worlds at once. A man who could sit at the table of the powerful and also trade the table's secrets to another empire. This is also where the story introduces the men he would cost everything for. He betrayed informants whose lives were fragile, who had chosen the most perilous path a human being can choose, to be a spy inside the other side. Names like Valery Martynov and Sergei Motorin were not mere code names. They were human beings who trusted American handlers, who met in cafes, who risked families and futures for a single cause. To betray them was not an abstract crime, it was a pure and particular violence.
Spying is often thought of as glamorous: elegant handshakes, coded broadcasts, briefcases sliding under rain-slick bridges. The reality is small, granular, and sickening. Hanssen's first period of treachery, the late 1970s into 1980, looks in the paperwork like a modest ledger. Tips about bugged sites, the identity of an American asset inside the GRU. To those who study the field, these items are not trivial. One leak, one name, is a detonator. He walked into the Soviet front, and in time the Soviets walked back to their cadres and changed the script of their own choices. Informants who had been feeding small tidings of vital information were compromised, arrested. In some cases, they were tried and executed. The agent the Bureau labeled Top Hat, a man who had walked a treacherous line inside the Soviet structure, was one whose exposure the United States could scarcely replace. The cost was not simply information lost on a sheet of paper, it was human life. And yet in the quiet after the arrests, in the backlog of internal memos, in the hush of the safe rooms, the question remaining was not just who, but why. For a time, Hanssen's wife Bonnie discovered the truth and confronted him. He promised to stop, telling her he fed the Soviets false information, that he was playing a dangerous game for national security. She believed, or perhaps chose to believe, because the alternative, that the man kneeling at Mass and teaching his children the Lord's Prayer could be a traitor, was unthinkable. Hanssen stopped for a while. The hiatus gave him a chance to be a husband who made mortgage payments and a father who read on the couch. He rose in the bureau, trusted by colleagues who could find no reason to doubt him. The temptation, though, did not die. Some cravings merely rest. They awaken. By the mid-1980s, global tensions had sharpened again. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and other proxy conflicts revived ideological heat. For Hanssen, this was a rarer motivation, not merely money, but pride, opportunity, the chance to demonstrate his cunning. He approached the Russians again, more brazen, more paid, more dangerous. The scale of damage increased accordingly.
Across 20 years of betrayal, the list of compromised projects reads like an index of American ingenuity. Hanssen's disclosures reached into operations designed to track Soviet officials, to monitor diplomatic compounds, even into contingency plans meant to sustain the American government in the direst emergencies. One after another, carefully constructed frameworks were undermined. Operation VIDS, a vehicle identification program designed to track suspect cars, collapsed when the Russians learned how it worked. Operation Monopoly, an audacious plan to tunnel under the Soviet embassy in Washington, found its plans compromised during construction. Had the tunnel worked, it might have carried microphones and revelation into the enemy's space. Instead, construction was doomed because someone at the center of the operation gave away the game before the jackhammer struck solid concrete. Perhaps the gravest of all was Hanssen's access to continuity of government plans. These were not sexy plots in the spy novel. They were the skeleton keys for survival, how the United States would move leaders to secret locations, who would carry the authority to speak for the country in a nuclear aftermath. To put those documents into enemy hands was to hand them a roadmap in case the unimaginable became real. That realization alone elevates his betrayal beyond petty corruption. It becomes existential. And the human toll continued. As the CIA and FBI cataloged losses, they began to see patterns. Agents who had been arrested and executed, operations that ended in rotted money and broken trust, networks that vanished into silence. The nation's covert architecture had holes. Each one was a person, each one was a family, each one was a quiet small ledger of grief.
There is no single button that explains why a man becomes a double agent, but the interviews, the psychiatric reports, the long debriefings offer a rough map. Inadequacy stitched together with fantasy, a craving for admiration turned into a compulsion for control, and a talent for compartmentalization that allowed him to live inside contradictory lives without cracking. Dr. David Shar, charged with probing the mind of this spy, spent hundreds of hours listening to the man tell his story. In the sessions, patterns emerged, an ego that required proof, a deep insecurity that sought validation, an appetite for risk that needed the adrenaline of deception. Money mattered. 6 children and the cost of private schools weigh on any household. But money alone cannot explain someone who betrays his nation for sums later shown to be small compared to the damage he created. There was also a sensual layer to Hanssen's life. Voyeurism, secret photographs, hidden cameras, ways to control and consume intimacy without exposing vulnerability. These behaviors are not excuses, they are fragments of a life that loved secrecy on multiple levels. Spies are often addicted to the game, to the thrill of being smarter than the people around them, to the delicious feeling of invisibility. Add to that an edge of resentment,
Promotions passed by, the Bureau's bureaucracy frustrated, and a man who thought himself brilliant left to manage spreadsheets rather than operations. Resentment breeds creative excuses, and a man who mastered systems could also bend them. This psychological swirl gave the Bureau an invisible foe. You cannot fix a virtue that functions as a wound. Compartmentalization made him effective at work while lethal in his private life. That paradox explains how the man who wore a cross in public could hand the names of informants to people who would kill them in private.
The late 1980s and 1990s were brutal for American intelligence because betrayal rarely travels alone. The Aldrich Ames scandal, another American who sold secrets, had already rocked the system. Agencies that should have watched their own were looking outward. After Ames, the instinct was relief. At last we have a culprit. But relief is fragile when losses continue. Rumors of leaks remain. Teams formed and reformed. The hunt spun in circles. In this climate, innocent men found a weight of suspicion too heavy to carry. Brian Kelly, a loyal CIA officer, became the focus of years of suspicion and humiliation. He was surveilled, interrogated, forced out of his career at a cost to his life and family. Later, when Hanssen's exposure cleared his name, the toll had been paid anyway. Reputations can be repaired on policy papers, reputations cannot be returned to the years they cost. The Bureau mounted task forces, hired outside consultants, and set up sting operations that were elaborate and risky. Hanssen's own mistakes, small misdrops, wrong corners of bridges, signals left in the wrong place, created openings. His tradecraft was meticulous, but human fallibility always enters. A package placed under a bridge the wrong way, a dead drop that went uncollected, a handwriting hint misread. Each created a thread investigators could tug. Behind the desks, men and women who had sworn to protect their assets began to suspect an internal leak. The possibility that the traitor walked among them was repellent. Institutions do not like to look inward. It is harder to believe that your colleague is the enemy than to imagine a foe across the sea. But crises force introspection, and so the search sharpened.
Hanssen's craft was not improvisational. He devised a system of signals, white adhesive tape placed in precise locations to indicate a drop had been made. He used aliases such as Raymond Garcia. He preferred dead drops and anonymous envelopes. He wanted to be invisible, to operate within the gray spaces of a city's rhythms. Yet his method also reeked of ego. He wrote letters to handlers that outlined the parameters of payment, diamonds, cash, eventual exfiltration. He was not a desperate man asking for the smallest coin. He was the architect of ongoing relationships. He wanted a scheme with guarantees. In his correspondence, he often demanded proof of attention, proof that the Russians knew they had a prize. This desire for proof would later be his undoing. When a package of letters and an audio cassette reached the Bureau by way of an old KGB source, it contained the clues investigators needed. Fingers were compared. Familiar idioms in language, a turn of phrase, a derogatory term that recalled a man's past, activated memory in the desks of translation specialists. One of the agents who read the notes, Jim Milburn, realized the cadence of a phrase matched a man he once shared a cubicle with, Robert Philip Hanssen. It was not a dramatic chase across continents. It was paperwork, language, and the slow sliding together of moments of recognition. Tradecraft is precise, but the human mind sometimes knows a voice or a phrase in a way machines cannot.
Hanssen's spy life was not continuous. He went quiet for years, then reinitiated contact in the late 1990s, an era in which the Soviet tower had fractured into new institutions. The KGB split, the GRU shifted, the USSR dissolved, and in the chaos, Hanssen saw opportunity. He tried to re-establish ties with officers he believed not to be under surveillance. He adapted his dead drops to new neighborhoods. But the long quiet had not erased old traces, and the net investigators were building had improved. He was clever about timing. He checked the FBI's automated case system for any trace points that could link back to him before he reached out. He tested the waters. Yet in October 1999, he sent a letter that reopened communications. The man on the other side of the ledger accepted his old alias. He returned to the game with new demands, indicating both the greed and the hunger that had never left him. Behind the scenes, the Bureau had changed too. The hunt for the mole had found a new path. A dossier had surfaced from an ex-KGB officer being recruited by the Bureau, and among the papers sent was a bag with a note, "Do not open."
The Bureau opened it. They analyzed its fingerprints. They listened to a cassette tape and realized the voice was not the wrongly suspected agent, but someone else. A detective's memory, a phrase, a parochial joke, the odd use of a city reference, slid the investigators toward one name.
Once suspicion solidified, the Bureau did what it does well, a sting. They built an elaborate cover and baited Hanssen with the offer he could not refuse, a plum position to keep him away from classified systems, a promotion, the soft flattery that feeds many egos. The proposal was a ruse and a mirror, give him recognition and keep him within reach. Surveillance suddenly became dense. The Bureau wired rooms, bought houses across from his house to peer from upstairs windows, and embedded a junior agent, Eric O'Neill, to serve as his associate. The men who had once been colleagues watched him live, watched the small rituals that betrayed less than the swollen ledger of his life, the small packets he wrapped in trash bags, the neat way he marked a sign with white tape, the specific rhythms of his days. One afternoon, in February 2001, the sting was placed at Foxtone Park. Armed teams watched as Hanssen executed a dead drop and walked back toward his car. Time slowed. The arrest was calm, surreal almost. The man who had handed so much away merely looked puzzled and asked, "What took you so long?" He offered no resistance. That trivial line, "What took you so long?" sounded like the voice of a man surprised only at the bureaucratic delay of justice.
The moment of arrest does not erase the years. It only creates a punctuation point after a sentence that has been long in writing. Under the searchlight of interrogation, the remainder of Hanssen's life spilled. The dates, the dead drops, the payments, the names he betrayed. The Bureau found letters, Palm Pilots, SD cards, and writings that corroborated the long chain of treachery. His wife Bonnie was stunned. In interviews later, she described the small domestic moments that made the revelation intolerable, the day she found the letter and the way his eyes narrowed as he confessed. She had once told him to stop. He had promised. Promises, in that household, were like tissues on a shelf, available, replaceable, quickly gone. Hanssen pleaded not to go to trial. He sought a plea that would spare some scandal from the public record and perhaps give him a structured exit. But the record would be public enough. He forfeited millions in money and luxuries. He agreed to a debrief. The Bureau wanted the story of the times and the names of networks, not only for punishment, but for repair.
If a spy story is often framed as a battle of wits between rival intelligence services, the reality is that ordinary people pay the bill. Families of compromised agents learned of deaths and disappearances in paragraphs. Children were told their parents had vanished. Careers were ruined. Men like Brian Kelly suffered years of humiliation as suspicions swirled before being exonerated. Some never recovered. Aldridge Ames, another mole, had already provoked a crisis. But every mole compounds the sense that the field is leaky, that no structure can be perfectly sealed. For the families left behind, there is only grief and the practical difficulties of trying to rebuild a life after betrayal. For institutions, the costs are budgets wasted, networks burned, and a constant gnawing need to re-examine the ways they trust one another.
Hanssen's punishment was severe and calculating. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts and was sentenced to life without parole. He was sent to a supermax prison to live mostly in a concrete box. 1 hour of exercise, quiet walls, the droning weight of time. For some, isolation is punishment greater than death. For others, it is a place where reflection becomes impossible. Psychiatric interviews conducted as part of his debriefing painted a man divided. A love of secrecy, a thirst for recognition, a hunger for what he felt he'd been denied. Analysts concluded that motives were mixed: money, ego, resentment, and a compartmentalization so perfect it permitted a man to kneel at Mass and also place names on an enemy's ledger. Years later, he would die alone in his cell, an end that many would see as a small and appropriate punctuation. But in the aftermath, institutions moved. Systems were overhauled. The Webster Commission restructured security protocols. Polygraphs now reach further into management ranks. The FBI changed its ways, not because it wanted to confess past failures, but because it could not stand to risk such damage on a future day.
Hanssen's exposure was not only a scandal, but a wake-up call. The Bureau implemented sweeping changes to computer security, to compartmentalization of sensitive material, to oversight and polygraph demands for senior managers. The lessons were expensive and technical, but they pivoted around a simple truth.
Never let blind faith in a uniform be greater than the facts on a screen. But reforms never fully erase human error and complexity. Intelligence services are built by humans, and humans err. They lie, they cheat, they betray, they redeem. And after Hanssen, the Bureau faced a series of tough questions. How far should trust be probed? How much suspicion destroys esprit de corps? Which will you surrender, privacy or safety? The answers have no tidy conclusion. Among the changes, some positives emerged: improved vetting, more intrusive audits, better tracking of access. But the story also left a scar on morale. Colleagues who had once trusted one another now knew the cost of presumption. And the families of those lost could never reclaim what they had been promised.
What do we do with a story like this when it ends in concrete and confession? We look at ourselves. The man who betrayed the nation was a husband and father who once tucked his children in, a man who pretended to be a saint in the eyes of the small community that loved him. He was also a secret dealer who handed lives to death. If we are honest, we do not simply want villains and heroes. We want to understand how easy it is to become both. We want to see how institutions fail and how human frailty becomes a lever in the hands of men who would use it to move the world. We want, perhaps, to forgive, not to excuse, but to understand the conditions that let betrayal blossom. In the end, what the Hanssen case teaches us is not merely that we must be vigilant, but that vigilance alone is not enough. We must design systems that do not rely on mythical trust. We must nurture cultures that admit weakness and help repair it before it warps into treachery. We must also remember the human cost: the agents in foreign prisons, the families left with only a memory and a name crossed through a ledger. As you step away from this story, let the final image be simple. A small suburban home, a man on his knees at a kitchen table with a letter in front of him, and a wife with a chance to choose what to believe. Let the final feeling be not only outrage but sorrow, at a life wasted, at trust betrayed, and at the slow, relentless work of learning how not to repeat the same mistakes. Because stories like these are not just about spies, they're about us, our limits, our pride, our need to be seen and loved. They're about the peril of secrets left to fester, and about the quiet courage it takes to speak the truth, even when the truth will break everything we thought we knew.